Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Chi Association, and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe. Educational Alpha is sponsored by iCapital, the financial technology company with the mission to power the world's alternative investment marketplace. Part innovator, part educator, and part navigator of the alternatives industry, iCapital offers intuitive, scalable digital solutions that have transformed how private market and hedge fund investments are bought and sold. With iCapital, financial advisors, wealth managers, and asset managers around the world now have access to everything they need to deliver the return and diversification potential of alternatives to high net worth investors. To learn more, visit iCapital.com.
For this informative discussion, we have the privilege of hosting Edmund Murphy, an esteemed expert in the field of retirement services. With a keen understanding of the intricacies of the industry, Edmund imparts wisdom on a wide range of crucial topics, including the importance of user experience and operational excellence, as well as the challenges involved in providing accessible financial services to individuals from diverse backgrounds. As we navigate the complex realm of retirement planning, he sheds light on accommodating a mobile workforce and developing strategies to promote fulfilling retirements. Listen in on this exploration of the dynamic field of retirement services.
Ed Murphy, welcome to Educational Alpha.
Thank you, Bill. It's good to be here.
It's great to, I guess, not quite see you, but hear you. I think we've got a lot to talk about, the future of retirement, the role that you play, the role Empower plays. There's been a lot of change in your side of the industry and change full stop, but maybe by point of reference, a little bit on your background and what led you to Empower.
Sure. Well, I started my career at Merrill Lynch as an FA back in the mid-'80s and then transitioned to Fidelity. Spent 17 years at Fidelity, primarily in three areas: the retail area, institutional, primarily the defined contribution space, and then I spent about 5 years in the private equity area within Fidelity. Fidelity, as you may know, owns a lot of businesses, typically wholly owned subsidiaries, and so I ran some of those businesses and had oversight for others. And then 2009, I made the transition to Putnam to work with my old colleague, Bob Reynolds, to really reintroduce Putnam to the defined contribution space. I think we had about 25 employees at the time, and the whole idea was to try to bring something new, unique, and different, particularly around the user experience, to the marketplace. And we did that. And then before too long, we essentially took that business within Putnam and we merged it with our sister company, Great West Financial in Denver, both entities owned by Great West Lifeco in Canada, which is controlled by Power Corporation, which is essentially owned by the Desmarais family. In 2014, we made the decision to buy the JP Morgan retirement business, and we essentially merged the Putnam business with the Great West Retirement Services business along with JP Morgan, and then we rebranded the entity Empower. We've been kind of off to the races, growing organically and then opportunistically through acquisitions, as you know.
I took a note, and I'm going to come back to this, about the beginnings of your career as a financial advisor and what that might have looked like back then versus now, but I'll park that for a moment. So the record-keeping space, I think so many parts of our business have become a substantial tech play. And technology used to be a back office function, a cost center, but now it's integral to the strategy. And I think also maybe marrying that up against scale, particularly in the business you're in. I think scale does matter. Integration is hard and costly, but maybe talk about both sides of that, the importance of scale if you want to be a player in this space, and Empower clearly is, and then the role of maybe technology, maybe circa 2015 versus now. And I think that probably the change is substantial.
Yeah, it's a really good point. When I think about our technology budget and how it's grown exponentially over the years, it's roughly 22 to 24% of our total expense base. And that's obviously investing in the infrastructure and the platform itself and all the capabilities associated with that. But it's also around the user experience, using a compelling interface, if you will, in a customer engagement model that really keeps the sponsor and the participants fully engaged and really focused on driving outcomes. And so that's an area where we spend a lot of time and a lot of investment, because at the end of the day, it's really about driving that engagement. And if you can drive the engagement, you can drive the outcomes. And the most critical outcome, obviously, that we're all driving towards is income replacement, so that our clients and our participants are not in a situation where they're outliving their income in retirement. So that's a huge focal point for us. But going back specifically to your question, Bill, on scale, we define scale as the next participant or the next customer we bring on the platform. We're bringing that customer on at a lower cost than the previous one. It's being able to extract those synergies, if you will, and getting the operating leverage. It's so critical to the business because similar to the investment management business, the asset management business, we've gone through a period of fee compression that is unabated. And I think when I look out over the next several years, I think we're going to continue to see that fee compression play out in all forms and all aspects of the business. So it's really important that you have critical mass and you have the scale to be able to compete and to be able to invest in the business. And I think we define scale very differently today than we would have defined it in 2015. And that's why you're seeing the level of consolidation that you're seeing in the marketplace today. In fact, if you look at the top 5 record keepers and administrators in the space today, they represent about 70% of the market share. And increasingly, it is a scenario where the rich or the larger institutions, if you will, are getting larger. I do think it gets to a point where there'll be less choice in the market, but the choice that remains will be companies that are well capitalized and that are fully committed to this business and are making the necessary investments to compete in the long run. So I do envision further consolidation. Obviously, Empower has contributed to that with the acquisition of the JP Morgan business, Mass Mutual, Prudential. We've also done a number of smaller transactions, and we've been able to do it in a way that's accretive and frankly has helped to accelerate our organic growth rate. I find every time we do a transaction and we're successful on onboarding clients, retaining customers, giving them a good experience, we tend to see a lift in our organic growth rates as well.
And you, a moment ago, Ed, you talked about the user experience, and the user you define as both the sponsor and plan participant. And it's the latter where the rubber hits the road. I think that's ultimately who we're servicing. And this concept of operational alpha, I think, is very much alive and well in what you just described, because more expenses, less return, and the opposite's true as well. And that can be defined in just a handful of basis points. But the other thing, you referred to your industry, the large getting larger, but it also maybe ties into the individual plan participant as well, where certainly people of certain means have access to certain services of financial planning and financial advice. But the vast majority of participants don't. And this can maybe manifest itself in a couple of ways. One is that I could be part of a plan where I've got great infrastructure and support, and that maybe works. But this is a very transient workforce in front of us. And I can use myself as an example, although I think I'm less transient than most. I'm now at Kaya 10 years. I've got a 401k plan here, but all of my 401k type savings is now in an IRA rollover. And that's just sort of up to me with a financial advisor to have advice on. And Kaya has some infrastructure in place too. But because we have such a transient workforce and no defined benefit plan, how do we make sure that these folks across the board stay on the grid and have healthy retirements post 65, 70, or whatever the retirement age is? And I don't know if that's your or my responsibility. Indirectly, it's all of our responsibilities, but maybe hearing a bit about how you think about that.
Look, I think that's critically important. And Power is one of several providers that joined the Auto Portability Consortium that was formed in the last year or so, primarily to address the leakage issue, particularly among those that can least afford to experience the leakage. I think you're going to see more cooperation like that across the industry, so that when there is a separation from service, whether it's a job change or retirement, that more of that money stays in the system. That's critically important. And I know that many of my competitors across the industry share that viewpoint. The one thing that I think has really changed, Bill, over the last 7 years is the sponsor's expectations and the participant, but particularly the sponsor's expectations of the provider, like an Empower, has changed and evolved. And it's gone beyond just simply providing administration and support for the plan itself, but rather more of a focus on the financial well-being of the end user, meaning that the services that we provide today really transcend retirement and are multi-goal, multifaceted to meet the needs of the end user. And some of those services we can provide directly. Some of them we can provide in conjunction with a financial advisor. That doesn't necessarily have to be an Empower financial advisor. It could be a third party. But the insatiable appetite for advice, whether it's embedded in a product or whether it's provided by a human being, is really driving the product development agenda at Empower and I think at other institutions, with this understanding that at any given time, 6% of the assets on our platform are in motion due to job changes and just the demographics playing out with more and more people retiring and 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day. And so if you think about it in that context, for a company like us with 1.5 trillion on our platform and 18 million Americans, that means $90 billion is in motion every single year. I think it's incumbent upon us, as well as the advisory marketplace, financial advisors across the board, to be in a position to meet the demand and to work with those end users to ensure that there is no disruption in service, and whether they want to keep the money in the plan or whether they want to roll it to a third party, we need to make sure that we can facilitate that in a way that minimizes the leakage. That's a big part of Empower's strategy, is to be able to do that. And my statement and my belief to our advisor partners out there is Empower can't in and of itself scale to meet the demand ourselves, but neither can the advisory community. And so we have to find a way to work together and have the right practices and the right model in place and the right product offering to ensure that we can be successful in dealing with that ultimate objective, which is to make sure that income replacement rates exceed that 75 pre-retirement target that we're trying to shoot for. So big focus for us and for others is to make sure that these relationships can continue, whether they continue in plan or out of plan, in a way that we can address customer need.
And I think that's a very important point that I think gets lost on many, that being we have to find ways of completing each other, not necessarily competing with each other. And obviously we're in a competitive business, and even on my side in the education space is some form of competition. Somebody's retirement, it's not a commoditized service. And the concept of robo-advice and model portfolios, it has a home somewhere, but the liability side of your balance sheet and mine and anybody else's can look very, very different, even though our net worth may be the same or our income may be the same. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So I think it's a tremendous responsibility there. Maybe a bit of a self-serving agenda item, access to alternative investments. And not just access to alternatives, but a wider aperture of diversifiers where investors can have a better outcome. And again, I can use my IRA rollover as an example. When I worked for companies on a 401k plan sponsor platform, the options were kind of uninteresting, garden variety, 40 Act mutual funds. And in the good old days, to show my age, there might have been a GIC on there. And they could have been money market funds when they were yielding something closer to 7 or 8% in my lifetime. There was nothing in terms of access to alts. And an interesting aspect, when you roll it into a self-directed IRA, I guess you got to know what you're doing steering this car, but it allows me greater access to self-directing into a wider set of options, which we don't have necessarily in the 401k space. So we do have to be careful in that private equity is not an asset class. It's a very complex industry. It can't possibly be crammed into a 40 Act fund. And we've even seen some challenges in interval funds. But you probably have a greater sense of this than I do, Ed, but not that many years ago, the DOL had talked about allowing more alternative exposure and target date funds. If I think about entry points, that one I find very interesting. But what is your view of the state of play with plan sponsors and having greater access beyond what I think are very efficient markets in the public equity and public debt space?
That's a really good question. I think for some of the larger, more sophisticated sponsors, There is an openness to it. As you suggested, the door was opened slightly by the DOL, providing a sense of safe harbor to start to think about how we can incorporate alternatives into defined contribution plans. This is something that we've been focused on for a while, working with partners, obviously. There's a lot of interest in the space, in particular because you've got a $10 trillion marketplace and you have an asset class, for example, like private equity, which is arguably one of the best performing asset classes in the last 20 years. And yet the retail investor, if you will, the defined contribution investor hasn't had access to that asset class. And I think where we see an opportunity is primarily replicating the target date structure, like a multi-asset class construct, where within that construct, you might have a liquidity feature, which is less important, I think, in a qualified plan, but you would have that. You might have real estate, you might have private credit, you might have private equity. And there's a lot of really good work, Bill, being done in this space today with the likes of Blackstone and others, where we've had really interesting conversations about taking a proof of concept, if you will, to some of our sponsors to get their input to evaluate whether this is something that they deem to be feasible. Obviously, from a sponsor standpoint, there are some concerns around fees, around liquidity, around the regulatory environment, and what liability may come with an offering like this. So I do think it'll take some time to play out. It's very much in its early stages, but there's demand on the sponsor side, and there's a lot of interest and a lot of smart people that are working on solutions that would move us a step toward more of a democratized environment, if you will, when you think about alternatives. So in some ways, I think we have a model for it, and it is the target date fund that I think could be leveraged in a way that could bring solutions like that to market.
I think maybe this falls under the heading of maybe professional management. And before we came on the air, I was mentioning my dad as an example. Started out in the Depression era, worked for a Great West company, Canada Life. He spent his entire career there, still alive at the age of 93. And we've got in-house long-term care for him. It is very, very expensive. But he was a prodigious saver and had a defined benefit plan that he's still reaping the benefits of. And that's a great, great safety net. But one of the benefits of defined benefit, not only do you get this annuity, but it's professionally managed by a third party. And I had Sarah Williamson on, ex-Wellington and now running FCLT based in Boston. I don't know if you've come across Sarah or not, but we talked about a potential model, and who knows, maybe this is fantasy land kind of stuff. But if I clipped my paycheck every 2 weeks, putting the money into a target date fund with reasonable exposure to alts is good and better than what I have today. But what might be very good is if I clipped it every 2 weeks and put it into some commingled fund that was professionally managed, a la the alternative investment sort of super fund model of Australia, where now I've got a professional management, a big fund. They have access to the very best managers, probably access to the very best fees, i.e. lower for me and more return. I don't know if that's feasible or not, but I think sometimes regulation has a tendency to try to cram very difficult and nuanced problems into an existing structure. And to try to fix this inside of a TDF, I don't know if that's the best outcome. But maybe if I try to wrap that into a question, the regulators, have been tinkering with the definition of an accredited investor, tinkering with what you can access and allocate inside of a target date fund. But how important is sensible regulation, especially in the retirement space? So this is the definitions of accredited investor as well as broader access. And could you envision an Australian type model?
I think so. I mean, even if you look at how the investment constructs evolved inside the defined contribution plans, increasingly you're seeing more sponsors gravitate towards collective trust, towards the concept of separate accounts. I think there's a construct and a model, if you will, from which you could build where you could adopt something similar to what you've talked about. In fact, among a lot of the sophisticated, larger, more complex qualified retirement plans, you're seeing sponsors gravitate away from the traditional 40 Act funds in favor of more unique custom type solutions. And that's in effect what you're referring to. So I do think that could get traction for sure.
Hopefully in our lifetime, we'll see. And maybe a related topic is this great generational transfer of wealth. And like you, perhaps I'm on the tail end of the baby boomer generation. And I think our generation is passing, I think some of these Cerulli numbers on the low end, I've seen 60 trillion, on the higher end, 80 or 90. Either way, it's a big, big number. And this maybe gets back to the future of advice. And if I look at the typical FA, it's probably a white male in his 60s. And that whole generation is graduating. And I think this next generation of our kids and beyond, perhaps what they're looking for is not their dad's or their mom's financial advisor. It might be something very, very different. And they're very curious. They're very socially aware, more so than our generation, maybe more aware around climate and other socially related issues on that front too. What do you see, going back to your days as an FA at Merrill Lynch? In some parts of that job, maybe have not changed at all, but maybe the future advice is going to be very different. On the one hand, we've got financial tools to use. But on the other hand, I think this generation is going to want to need a very different type of interaction and different type of help than perhaps we had.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think in some ways, this was sort of the impetus for us to acquire Personal Capital back in 2020. Personal Capital was considered to be, if not the best, certainly one of the best digital hybrid wealth management platforms, where they used technology and empowered clients to be able to use it and leverage it in a way that was intuitive and user-friendly and outcome-oriented. But at the same time, they married it with a human being, with an advisor. And I think that is the model for the future. And if I think about where the opportunity lies going forward, it's the advisor or the advisory firm that's able to look at things holistically, whether they custody the assets or not, and to be able to bring that together in a way that's seamless, both on the asset and on the liability side. So there's this connectivity that's seamless, that's intuitive, it's elegant, it's outcome-oriented. And in my view, Bill, I don't think anyone has mastered that today. If I think back to the comment you made about the magnitude of the wealth transfer opportunity, it's pretty significant. I think the wealth management industry, depending on how you want to define it, I think is probably going to be one of the greatest businesses or industries in the next 15 years in this country. And it's being able to solve that and connect those points in a way that is easy and user-friendly and intuitive, as I said earlier, I think is really what's critical. And that's why we, as well as others, I think, are spending so much time and investment around the customer experience. And I use that term broadly, whether it's through an app or whether it's through the interactions with the advisor or whether it's through the web. It doesn't really matter which channel you're using. All of it has to come together in a way that's seamless.
I agree. And it's not only that customers' experience, it's their assets in the first place. And that's what's driving this whole value proposition. So, Ed, in the remaining minutes, there's been a few innovations, and I don't know if it's the camel's nose in the tent or not, but I wanted to get your views on both distributed ledger technology or blockchain, and then also any form of generative AI and how you might be either thinking about or using some of these tools. Maybe I'll start with distributed ledger. And if I think about the record-keeping space, maybe that's primed for either disruption or maybe using permission DLT for greater efficiencies in your overall operation, greater efficiencies in dealing with the end customer as well. So is that something you're either thinking about adopting, and your views on whether or not that is part of a solution?
I think it's very much part of a solution for lots of different reasons, not the least of which is around data security and minimizing the amount of fraud that exists in the industry today. Within Empower, we've stood up a team a couple of years ago to work both internally, but also to work with third parties as we think about the best way to leverage blockchain in our environment. And so I do think it'll bring a sense of greater security, clearly more efficiency in the way we process transactions. And it is something that our team is focused on and working on I think in some ways it's still immature and it's in its early days, but we see it playing a very critical role. And I would state the same for generative AI. I think the use cases there extensive and cut across all aspects of our business. I would say within Empower, our principal focus early on has been primarily around application development, where the proof of concepts that we've been pursuing has been on coding new technologies as well as older technologies, leveraging generative AI tools and capabilities to be able to do that more seamlessly, more cost effectively, more efficiently. And we have an asset management business too. We're less of a manufacturer than the traditional asset manager. We do have an $80 billion general account portfolio. But even leveraging AI from the standpoint of security selection, investment research, there's a tremendous application there. And then there's applications everywhere. I mean, there's applications in terms of how we engage our customers. There's application around predictive analytics and being able to message customers in a way that's timely and germane to their needs and the experiences they're going through at any given time. So it's a big focus for us within Empower. And given the size and the scale that we have the benefit of being able to work with some of the best in the industry, the Microsofts, the Googles of the world, and others, to really think through the sequencing and how we want to leverage and apply that capability in our environment. So a lot of good work being done on that now.
I think you're striking the right balance because transition always is highly correlated to business risk and the concept of cyber risk and cybersecurity when everything's in the cloud and you've got generative AI. You've got to know where your data is coming from, and the risks are big, but we're in the risk management business full stop. So we have to embrace this technology, but to do it carefully. I'm just curious on any of your platforms, either record keeping or the advice side, are you seeing anything in the way of digital assets or digital currencies?
We haven't seen much demand for it, Bill. I think sponsors remain, very cautious around it, whether it's making digital assets available within the context of their defined contribution plans. Even in our personal wealth business, which is about a $65 billion business, we've seen very little interest in demand there as well. So it is something that, we continue to monitor. We can certainly support clients that have interest and needs in that area, but we haven't seen any widespread demand.
Yeah, again, probably early days. But it seems like the SEC is generally starting to loosen up on access to cryptocurrencies, and I'm not supporting them or dissing them. I just don't know enough about it. But I think even Fidelity has an investment option there too with Bitcoin. So we'll see how that unfolds.
Well, you've got a multitude of filings for ETFs, obviously, that, I think may end up getting some traction in the marketplace at some point. By the way, we've seen very little demand for ETFs inside the defined contribution construct. I think that could change over time, but obviously index funds and other passive investments have experienced a lot of traction, but ETFs have not.
So the Garden Variety 40 Act fund is preferable to the ETF?
Yes, for sure.
Why is that? I know the ETF is more tax efficient, and maybe since this isn't a tax deferred vehicle, but is the reason why that would be the case?
I think that's part of it. I think the other concern is I think sponsors really don't necessarily want their employees trading during the day. They want them focused on the task at hand. So it'll be interesting to see whether ETFs begin to get traction over the next several years. I suspect we'll see some, particularly around self-directed brokerage and those kinds of things. And those are most common among professional services firms like lawyers and doctors. And the traditional large corporate and government plans that we support, we haven't seen much interest.
And non-trading intraday, I think, leads to maybe a greater productivity, but also trying to day trade or market time your way to a better outcome will never work. So I think it checks a few boxes. So maybe lastly, Ed, in terms of financial advice, not for the audience, but I look at my kids. I've got 5 kids. They're mostly grown. And I look at them versus my generation, and I think they're more savvy in some ways, but far less savvy in terms of just financial literacy. They're not illiterate, but I don't think we've done a very good job as an industry and as a nation and as an educator teaching kids about some basic financial skills and tools early on. And they start making money and they're trying to figure it out maybe a little bit late in the game. So either through the lens of your kids or your day job, maybe how are we doing around financial literacy? And if you could wave a wand, or the things we can do differently and better. And maybe part of the answer is there's going to be a different component to advice going forward that may have to be a little bit more connected to the individual.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think it's a significant gap that we have both in the college system, but also in the grade school and high school system. We don't teach people about money. We don't teach people about savings behavior. We've had kind of a nascent effort within Empower where we have employees within the various, locations. We have employees in all 50 states, but we've had a volunteerism effort where we have this base level of curriculum and we have employees that are volunteering going into some of the school districts and the schools when they get support and sponsorship from the school boards and the local schools to teach classes, sort of ad hoc. But it's that kind of approach, I think, that starts to form a momentum and a groundswell behind it, because I do think it's critically important that we institutionalize money management and financial wellness, if you will, in helping young people think through the decision-making matrix as it relates to their personal finances and really looking at things from both the asset side, but also the liability side. I just don't think we do enough to prepare them for the real world in that regard. So we're trying to do our part. It's something I've thought a lot about, Bill. I think there's some interesting opportunities for a firm like ours and others to actually partner with some big retail, direct-to-consumer type entities to bring best-of-breed ideas and solutions to market to address this issue and see if we can't reverse course.
I agree. And I know you a bit personally and not looking to embarrass you, but I know you and your wife, Jennifer, have been tremendous supporters of community-based education off the Murphy family balance sheet. And I give you great credit for that, too.
Oh, thank you, Bill.
Something that we could all emulate. So
I'm all about trying to have an impact, and I think when you think about organizations or charities that you're considering supporting, I think one of the most important benchmarks is, can you make a difference? Can you make a tangible difference? Is there real powerful proof points in the end product? That's where I'm trying to focus. Thank you for that.
No, thank you. So we'll leave it there. Ed, great discussion. Great to hear from you. I think there's going to be more to come. Perhaps we can have you back at some point.
Love to. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then, by the way, I think it would be great to have you come and speak to the Empower management team at some point. I'll send that invite to you. I'd love to have you.
It would be a pleasure. Look forward to it.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the Chi Association and subscribe to the show at chia.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.